Hello everyone, my name is Peyton, and today I'll be discussing C. Wright Mill's conflict theory and how it applies to my job as a respite facilitator with vulnerable youth here in Calgary. C. Wright Mill's conflict theory, particularly his concept of the power elite, is useful in understanding the challenges a respite facilitator like myself faces in a social services agency. Conflict theory suggests that society is structured in ways that benefit the powerful at the expense of the less privileged. In the context of social services, this can be seen in how resources, policies, and decision-making are controlled by higher authorities, often leaving frontline workers like myself and vulnerable populations with limited power. When reviewing the interplay between my personal experiences in social services with the sort of white-collar rationalization and alienation in the workplace found in our class textbook, it is impossible not to address Mill's point regarding the three forms of power. These forms of power are coercion, authority, and manipulation. I've come to recognize manipulation as prevalent within the field I work in. Mills argues since our society is becoming more and more centralized and our economy structured according to principles of impersonal rationality, manipulation has placed coercion and authority as the main means by which power is exercised. The iron cage of bureaucratic rationality seeks to rationalize government administration and economic production to encourage efficiency to the point where we have a society with much rationality but little to no reason. One of the places I see this version of manipulation the most is with the manipulation of funding and resources allocated to social services agencies like the one I work for. For example, funding for one of the youth programs I work very closely with was recently cut, and the program was responsible for providing respite services for several families and their children. This program is in high demand amongst low-income families who are struggling to make ends meet and can't possibly work several jobs and look after their children, whom already come from very troubled backgrounds involving mental and physical trauma, with the addition of having life-altering diagnoses such as FASD, ASD, and ODD. These youth are often in and out of various foster homes, group homes, and are already marginalized, as close to 80% of persons served are Indigenous ancestry. There are several issues with this manipulation of funding and resources. Higher-level decision-makers such as the municipal and provincial governments, respectively, often control the funding allocated to programs like the one I mentioned, and they determine what program receives more funding and who qualifies for these services. I've noticed in my work that the divide between necessity and qualification continues to grow amongst vulnerable families, and their circumstances have to be exceedingly extreme in order to qualify for the type of services my agency provides. Even the families that do qualify have to jump through a variety of bureaucratic hoops and enigmatic paperwork that, for Canadians of which English is not their first language, may be very difficult to comprehend. Funding cuts, staffing shortages, and eligibility criteria may be justified as budget constraints, but Mills would argue that these decisions serve to protect elite interests rather than truly support workers or clients. They are not simply neutral budgetary decisions, but rather tools of power that serve elite interests. These decisions are framed as necessary due to financial limitations, but in reality, they often reflect who holds power and whose needs are prioritized. Funding is often redirected to serve elite interests, such as tax breaks for corporations, military spending, or political campaigns, rather than social programs that benefit working-class families. This ensures that wealth and power remain concentrated at the top, while frontline workers and vulnerable populations bear the brunt of austerity measures. Another form of control as a result of manipulation is understaffing, which is a huge issue in my agency. I've experienced firsthand how much the turnover rate truly is within nonprofit organizations like the one I work for. The chronic staffing shortages my agency faces often lead to excessive caseloads for my colleagues and me, which further increases burnout and turnover rates. Instead of hiring more workers with the already limited financial resources we are provided with, it often leads to agencies expecting frontline workers who remain to go the extra mile out of a sense of moral obligation rather than addressing the structural issues such as wage and working conditions to reduce the turnover rate. We know that Mills is a conflict theorist, and Mills' conflict theory in particular places emphasis on ideas and values as weapons rather than as a form of social glue that fosters cohesion. Mills believes that revolutionary change and conflict are necessary to bring about a more egalitarian society. Similar to the ideas of Karl Marx, but Mills rejects the idea of a classless utopia and is rather more reasonable in the sense that conflict and hierarchies will always exist but may be utilized so that equilibrium upholding status quo doesn't dominate. This domination is seen within my work as allowing those in power to keep costs low while ensuring that workers remain too overworked to organize for better conditions or challenge the system. Restrictive eligibility criteria is a huge issue and is often the result of manipulation at the hands of those in power. Many families I know personally and have worked with alongside often struggle to qualify for those services, whether it be an FSCD contract or simply being unable to provide the excessive documentation required by municipal and provincial governing bodies, not to mention the extremely long wait lists. After funding was cut from the other program I mentioned earlier, I've been waiting months to receive confirmation that the youth I once worked with received their FSCD contracts that allow them to be eligible for the respite care my program provides. This restrictive eligibility criteria produces barriers that reduce the number of people receiving aid, making the system appear more cost-efficient without actually addressing community needs. This benefits policymakers and administrators because it allows them to claim they are managing funds responsibly, even though they are withholding resources from those who need them the most. Those in power shift financial responsibility away from the power elite by presenting these monetary decisions that cut funding as financially unavoidable. Those in power avoid accountability for how they choose to distribute those resources. As a result, burden is placed on the frontline workers who must enforce the policies and on families who are blamed for not meeting the criteria or for not trying hard enough to navigate the system. This deflects criticism from those making the decisions while reinforcing the idea that suffering is a result of individual shortcomings rather than systemic inequities. In our class textbook, Mills argues that in primitive societies, the means of power are simpler and decentralized, so that historical change tends to be a local product. However, in modern societies, there has been a great increase in the scope and centralization of power. A few strategically located individuals with institutional power make key decisions that can alter structural conditions under which we live. This centralization has engorged the history-making power of elites. The power elite are people like policymakers who manipulate frontline workers, like myself, through bureaucracy. I've personally experienced policies and regulations that are framed as fair and necessary, but in practice, they often serve as barriers to my service. For example, I spent a lot of time navigating complicated paperwork, strict eligibility rules, and appeal processes that limit the amount of time I can put forward to facilitating experiential learning activities for the youth that I work with. This illusion of fairness allows those in power to deflect responsibility, placing blames on individuals rather than the system. The final form of manipulation I would like to talk about regarding Mills' forms of power is the emotional manipulation of frontline workers. In social services agencies, emotional manipulation is often used as a tool to maintain control over workers, ensuring they remain dedicated to their roles despite low wages, high stress levels, and overwhelming workloads. This form of ideological control, as C. Wright Mills would describe it, keeps employees compliant by appealing to their sense of duty and moral responsibility, rather than addressing the deeper structural issues that create their difficult working conditions. Social workers, respite facilitators, and other frontline employees frequently enter the field with a deep desire to help others, and agencies capitalize on this altruism by reinforcing the idea that their work is not just a job, but a moral calling. This rhetoric serves to justify poor working conditions and prevent resistance, as any pushback, such as asking for better pay, more support, or manageable workloads, is framed as selfish or as a distraction from the mission of helping vulnerable populations. One of the most common tactics used in this form of manipulation is the idea that the work should be its own reward, in the sense that workers are often told that the fulfillment of making a difference in people's lives should outweigh financial compensation or personal well-being. This mindset discourages them from advocating for themselves because it suggests that asking for fair pay or better conditions is equivalent to prioritizing themselves over their clients. This not only normalizes exploitation, but also places an unfair emotional burden on workers, making me feel guilty for wanting a work-life balance. As a respite facilitator, for instance, I often feel pressured to work extra shifts, take on more clients than I can reasonably handle, or provide emotional labor beyond my job description. All under the justification that if I truly care about the people I serve, I will make sacrifices. This manipulation fosters a toxic work culture where overwork is expected and glorified, and those who set boundaries are seen as less committed or even unworthy of the role. Mill's concept of ideological control explains how this emotional manipulation functions to mainstream existing power structures by framing overwork as a virtue and financial demands as greed. Agencies prevent collective resistance from forming among workers if employees were to recognize that their struggles stem from systemic issues rather than personal shortcomings. They might demand better wages, unionize, or push back against harmful policies. However, when workers internalize the belief that their hardships are just part of the job, they are less likely to challenge authority. Instead, they may blame themselves for struggling or feel isolated in their frustrations, which further reinforces their compliance. This serves the interest of those in power, executive policymakers, administrators who benefit from maintaining a low-cost, high-output workforce while avoiding scrutiny for the structural problems in social services. Ultimately, Mills would argue that emotional manipulation is a subtle but powerful tool used to maintain control over workers without the need for direct coercion. By making employees feel morally obligated to endure poor conditions, social services agencies ensure a steady supply of dedicated but overworked and underpaid labor. Without recognizing and addressing this form of control, workers may continue to sacrifice their well-being for a system that exploits their compassion rather than truly supporting them and their clients. So in conclusion, C. Wright Mills' conflict theory provides a crucial framework for understanding the systemic issues faced by frontline workers in social services, particularly in roles like mine as a respite facilitator. The power elite, government officials, corporate leaders, and high-ranking policymakers manipulate funding, staffing, and eligibility criteria under the guise of budget constraints while maintaining their own interests and control. This creates an environment where the most vulnerable populations struggle to access necessary support, while frontline workers are overworked, underpaid, and emotionally manipulated into accepting poor conditions. Mill's insight on power, particularly his emphasis on ideological control, highlight how emotional manipulation is used to keep workers compliant, framing their labor as a moral duty rather than a profession that deserves fair compensation and support. By recognizing these structural barriers and the forces that sustain them, we can begin to challenge the status quo and push for meaningful changes that prioritize both the well-being of workers and the communities they serve. Conflict, as Mill suggests, is inevitable in any hierarchical system, but awareness of these power dynamics is the first step to advocating for more just and equitable society.